Hey, it's Annalicia. What you're about to tune into is an episode from my Exercise 180 podcast. My E180 podcast is a private podcast for my E180 members only. The first 18 episodes consist of the audio-only version of my E180 course lessons, plus my Fit and Fabulous for Life masterclass. Episode 19 marks the beginning of extended E180 content and includes audio notes from me, so top-of-mind insights from my personal life and responses to questions from my E180 members, plus interviews with other thought leaders. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an E180 member and getting access to this private podcast, go to the description box of this video. You'll find a special link there that will allow you to become a member at a major discount. Now, on to the topic at hand. Hey, it's Annalicia. I'm really happy to be in your ear today, responding to a brilliant question I received from one of you recently about emotional eating. Before I dive into that, though, I wanted to remind you that within each show note, there's a link to a form you can use to ask me questions or share your thoughts and insights. So when you click on that link, you'll read a little message from me that goes something like this. I say, I don't want the E180 philosophy to just be a theory for you. I want it to come alive in your life. But it takes time and practice to integrate this new way of living. In the process, you're bound to have some struggles and a lot of new questions arise, plus new insights and things to celebrate. Share them with me. You can type me a long, eloquent message or some quick, messy thoughts. It's all anonymous, and I promise to read through each submission, and I'll do my best to address your submission in an upcoming E180 podcast episode. And then after that little excerpt from me, there's a little box where you can type whatever you want, and it comes directly to me. No other eyes are seen on it. And like I said in the little excerpt, I read through each submission and then do my best to create a podcast out of it. So I love hearing from you. Never hesitate to click that link and let me know what's going on in your world. Okay, on to the question I received about emotional eating. It went something like this. Annalicia, I was listening to the episode you did on intuitive eating, episode 56. I loved it, and it got me thinking about a lot of things, like the intersection between biology and emotions. On one hand, intuitive eating talks about honoring and respecting your biological cues, like hunger. On the other hand, it also talks about acknowledging the emotions connected to why you eat. So I'm wondering, is it even possible to not emotionally eat? And is emotional eating really that bad? When is emotional eating quote-unquote bad or unhealthy? Is it ever bad? And if it's not ever bad, how do we know when it's driven by intuition or instinct and when it's driven by something else? Wow. I love that question so much. Thank you for reaching out. And I think I want to start with the acknowledgement that the diet culture has really demonized emotional eating. So within that paradigm of thought, we've been sold the food is fuel idea, right? Which, of course, isn't all bad. You know, I like the analogy that if you gave your car the wrong fuel or really poor quality fuel, it's going to have a really hard time operating. You know, so like if you generalize that analogy to your body, it's good to get to know your body and respect what your body needs. So you're giving it the right fuel. It's good to think in terms of quality of your food. I like all that. But what I really struggle with this idea is, why are we comparing humans to machines? Humans are biological creatures. We are spiritual creatures. We are emotional creatures. We are creative creatures. What we are not is machines. Now, when it comes to cars, their gas is fuel, period. But when it comes to humans, our food is fuel, and it is other things. It's many other things. It's much, much more than just that. Now, if you think back to our Fit and Fab masterclass, that's episode 1, the very first episode here on the podcast, if you'd like to revisit it, you'll remember that when I'm discussing secret number 7 of how to find your healthy living sweet spot, which is think holistically, I changed the labels on the quadrants to freedom and bondage and engaged and disengaged. So prior to that, the labels were happy and unhappy and healthy behavior and unhealthy behavior. So here's what I say at that point in the masterclass. I have an important question for you to consider. If you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, if you're wreaking havoc on important aspects of your life in pursuit of improving your physical health, is that truly healthy? The answer is no. The time has come for us all to have a higher standard of what we label as quote unquote healthy. And the only way to make that happen is to not only, number one, bring the intangibles into the conversation, but also, number two, stop compartmentalizing life. We must make the conversation broader, more holistic. With that being said, I'm really excited to introduce you to the 4 quadrants of life. These 4 quadrants are very similar to the 4 quadrants you've seen before, in that we're bringing the intangibles and the tangibles together. With the 4 quadrants of life, you'll notice the intangibles are still on the y-axis, simply with a different label, perspective. And the tangibles are still on the x-axis with the new label, action. The big difference here is instead of only focusing on physical health habits, we're broadening the labels and therefore broadening the conversation. In other words, we're making the conversation about health more holistic and therefore making our thinking around health more holistic as well. So I bring this part of the masterclass up because the food is fuel idea not only narrows our focus into thinking of quote unquote health only in terms of physical health habits, it also goes a step further and asks you to operate as a machine. So we have who we actually are: spiritual creatures, biological creatures, creative creatures, emotional creatures. Then the diet culture says, just be one of those things. Be a physical creature. And operate not as a biological one, operate as a mechanical one. Can you see the toxicity of this? Can you feel the heavy burden it places on you from the get-go to operate in ways that are unnatural, to think of yourself in terms that are simply incorrect? So let's bring this all back to the first question that was asked. Is it even possible to not emotionally eat? And is emotional eating really that bad? My answer is emotions are always a part of eating, and emotional eating is never bad. It's just information. So diet culture has tricked us into believing that you can engineer emotions out of your eating experience, and that this is a quote unquote good or a quote unquote healthy thing to do. But it is not only not good and not healthy, it is also not possible. Emotions always have and always are and always will be 100% of the time a part of the eating experience. And that's because emotions always have and always are and always will be 100% of the time a part of the human experience. So instead of trying to do the impossible, which is engineering emotions out of your experience, I think it is so much healthier and so much more productive to look at ways we can change our relationship with our emotions. And I think one way to do this, as I alluded to before, is to start to practice seeing them as information versus labeling them as good or bad. Now, let's just take a breath here, because this might be making you really uncomfortable. Like, how do I even do that? Or I always see them as good or bad, and now I feel bad about that. If you're having thoughts or feelings along any of those lines, you're definitely not alone, and it's not your fault. The diet industry and many other industries in our Western culture are literally hell-bent on convincing us all to think in this way. But you can use our 4 quadrants of life to, baby step, begin thinking differently. Because remember, the essence of each quadrant is really about feelings and emotions. So the bottom right-hand quadrant is meant to represent the feelings and emotions of exhaustion, depletion, lack of sustainability, lack of joy, burnout. The top left-hand quadrant is meant to represent the feelings and emotions of lack of motivation, lack of awareness, lack of consciousness, and lack of purposefulness. The bottom left-hand quadrant is meant to represent the feelings and emotions of embarrassment, intimidation, guilt, anxiety, and shame. And the top right-hand quadrant is meant to represent the feelings and emotions of joy, inspiration, intuition, instinct, satisfaction, sustainability, flow, and peacefulness. So when we notice that we're feeling in any of these ways, we can identify what quadrant we're in. And when we can identify what quadrant we're in, there's information there. Information about where the quadrant lands on the vicious 180 cycle, for example. Information about the common perspectives of that quadrant. Information about the common actions of that quadrant, and so on and so forth. Now, when we take emotional eating out of the realm of good or bad, and we put it into the realm of information, this requires the practice of unblending. So you might remember that we talked about unblending in episode 59 here on the podcast. That was part 2 of our 4-part emotional health and healing series. If you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend tuning in when you're done with this one. And even if you have, it might be worth revisiting, because unblending is this powerful yet subtle practice of being an empathetic witness to your own life experience. So put into E180 terms, it's the practice of getting better and better at recognizing what quadrant you're in, not making yourself right or wrong for being in that particular quadrant, and realizing that there are still 3 other quadrants at play. So 3 other quadrants in existence while you're in the one quadrant you're in. When we're not practicing unblending, it's very easy to get consumed by the emotions and feelings and thoughts and actions of any one particular quadrant. So instead of having a broad, expansive focus, we narrow in, we fixate, we cling. And one thing we fixate on or cling to is our morality. So our perceived goodness or our perceived badness. And when we're in that blended state, we really believe our perceptions of morality. So, for example, let's say you're unconsciously blending with the bottom right-hand quadrant. Maybe you're following some sort of strict diet protocol and you're following it very well. So you feel like you're being really good. Then, eventually, you say, forget it, and you binge on chocolate ice cream and potato chips and diet soda. So in other words, you jump up to the top left-hand quadrant, and for a few moments you feel free and you feel happy. But then the guilt sets in, not to mention your physical body probably doesn't feel so hot either. So you drop down and you unconsciously blend with the bottom left-hand quadrant. And now not only do you feel bad, but you also think you are bad. In fact, you're convinced of it. But if you were to practice unblending, you would still allow yourself to feel the uncomfortable sensations and emotions of the bottom left-hand quadrant, but you wouldn't identify with it. So you might say to yourself, I'm noticing I'm in the bottom left-hand quadrant. There are still 3 other quadrants in existence. I've been in all 3 of those quadrants before, and I will be again. So identifying myself as a bad person as a result of this temporary experience isn't even logical. Do you feel the power in that? Do you feel the capacity of that? Do you feel the empathy there? And I think ultimately, whenever we're eating from a place of what the authors of intuitive eating call emotional hunger, it is always because there is a lack of empathy present. And this holds true whenever we're constricting our eating from a place of emotional hunger. There's a lack of empathy present with that too. Now, let's take a breath on that, because the diet industry certainly would not want constriction of eating due to an emotional hunger to fall under their label of emotional eating, would they? So that's really something to think about. So we've come a long way with this already, haven't we? We've really unpacked this idea of emotional eating. So now let's address the final question that was sent to me. If emotional eating is never bad, how do we know when it's driven by intuition or instinct and when it's driven by something else? It's such a great question. And I think the key to answering this question lies within the term I just used, which is emotional hunger. So as I mentioned, I learned this term, this idea from the authors of intuitive eating. Now, if you go to episode 56, I discuss all 10 of the principles of intuitive eating in depth, so I highly recommend you check that out at some point if you haven't already. But what I'm going to do here is just read the summary of 2 of those 10 principles, because I think these 2 really illuminate the intersection of biology and emotions that the questioner was really contemplating when they reached out. So the first summary I'm going to read is that of principle number 2, which is honor your hunger. It says, keep your body biologically fed with adequate energy and carbohydrates. Otherwise, you can trigger a primal drive to overeat. Once you reach the moment of excess hunger, all intentions of moderate, conscious eating are fleeting and irrelevant. Learning to honor this first biological signal sets the state for rebuilding trust in yourself and in food. And then the second summary I'm going to read is principle number 7, which is cope with your emotions with kindness. It says, first, recognize that food restriction, both physically and mentally, can, in and of itself, trigger a loss of control, which can feel like emotional eating. Find kind ways to comfort, nurture, distract, and resolve your issues. Anxiety, loneliness, boredom, and anger are emotions we all experience throughout life. Each has its own trigger, and each has its own appeasement. Food won't fix any of these feelings. It may comfort for the short term, distract from pain, or even numb you, but food won't solve the problem. If anything, eating for an emotional hunger may only make you feel worse in the long run. You'll ultimately have to deal with the source of the emotion. So, I just love that term, emotional hunger. And I think that when we're eating or constricting our eating from a place of emotional hunger, what we won't feel is satisfied, which makes sense, right? It's logical. A physical intervention is not meant to satisfy an emotional need. I think this also makes sense because the only place satisfaction is felt is in the top right-hand quadrant of our 4 quadrants of life. And in that quadrant, emotions are a part of eating, but there's not an emotional hunger there. Does that make sense? Instead, there's an emotional satisfaction, an emotional health that's present. And when emotional health and when emotional satisfaction is present, then we can hear. Then we can tap into our intuitive, our instinctual, our biological cues. But when emotional health, when emotional satisfaction is not present, it's very hard to tap into instinct. It's very hard to tap into intuition. It's very hard to tap into our biological wisdom. And that's because the emotional hunger is more ravenous than all of that. Wisdom, in whatever form it comes, whether it's biological or spiritual, creative or emotional, is usually pretty subtle and quiet, isn't it? There's a calm resolve to it, you could say. So I guess put another way, emotional hunger demands attention, while instinct, intuition, biological wisdom all wait calmly to be heard, to be discovered, to be unlocked. I guess what it really comes down to is tending to our emotional health directly and profoundly affects our physical health. Now, if you're looking for ways to feed your ravenous emotional hungers with what that type of hunger is truly craving, which is emotional healing, then I highly, highly recommend you check out the 4-part emotional health and healing series I recently released right here on the podcast. If you go to episode 57, you'll find an introduction to that series. In the meantime, remember that anytime you're willing to practice unblending, anytime you're willing to get curious and get information versus declare yourself good or bad, anytime you're willing to be a kind, empathetic witness to your life experience, you are doing your body and your mind a world of good. Always remember, true health is awakening to kindness, and awakening to kindness is the E180 way.